Hello everybody, this is Jason from STEM Nerds. Thank you for being here. Glad you are here with us today because in today's video, we have to build on a concept that we have actually been building now for a few videos, and that is metabolism and how we classify microbes based on their metabolic requirements. Now, we've done this before in a previous video, and if you have not seen the videos directly related to metabolism, I highly recommend check those out first. I will put them in the upper right-hand corner as well as in the description below because you're going to need that foundational information to really appreciate what we're going to be talking about here. And what we're going to be talking about here are all of those words that we use to describe microbial metabolism, such as, well, we had things like anaerobes and aerobes and facultative anaerobes and chemoorganotrophs and chemolithotrophs. But here what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit more meat into what does that mean? Where do we actually find these organisms? What are these organisms and how do they relate to us as human beings? So the first thing I want to do is a quick review, and that review is on these two important concepts, oxidation and reduction. We talked about those concepts a couple videos ago. As it relates to energy metabolism, what we need to understand is anytime we say an organism is oxidizing something, what we're saying is it's using a compound or a substance as an electron source or an energy source or a food source. It all means pretty much the same thing to us, okay? So when you see oxidize, it's critical as we move forward in this video that you link electron, energy, or food source. Similarly, if you see the word reduction or an organism is reducing something, we need to understand that the organism is using that thing as a terminal electron acceptor. Remember, all organisms have both. They have an electron source and they have a terminal electron acceptor. So we need to know those two things. Now that we know that, we can move on. All right, so let's take a look at these different categories. The first one is the anaerobic chemolithotroph. And what we've learned in the last couple of videos, hopefully, is that if the organism is anaerobic, it is reducing something that is not oxygen. So some examples that we see here are things like nitrate, sulfate, CO2 would all be examples of something an organism can reduce, use as a terminal electron acceptor that is not oxygen, thus anaerobic. On the chemolithotrophic side, we understand, hopefully by now, is that what we have is a chemical source of energy, and that chemical, litho, is inorganic. And so some examples of what's being oxidized, hydrogen, iron, things like that. So it's not carbs, lipids, proteins. All right, so those are the combinations that we're dealing with for our anaerobic chemolithotrophs. Now, where do we typically find these organisms? Well, we have to kind of think this through a little bit. You have an anaerobic organism. An obligate anaerobe is actually killed by oxygen. And so it's important to understand that because that means these microbes are going to be in an environment that lacks oxygen. Otherwise, it'll kill it. So lacks oxygen. And because it's chemolithotrophic, usually there's not going to be a ton of organic compounds around, although there can be. But typically what we're talking about, these anaerobic chemolithotrophs can be the foundational organisms in a food web. And so we're used to hearing about phototrophs, right? Plants and things like that being the foundation of the food web. Well, what about in areas where there is no visible light? It's these guys. Usually it's our anaerobic chemolithotrophs. You can find them in swamps, deep in the soil, as long as there's moisture, in aquatic substrate, again, deep, really far down in the bottom of the ocean where there's not a lot of oxygen or close to none. And we're dealing with a situation where we don't have a lot of organic compounds. And they are the foundation of the food web down there. So really important group of organisms. Another important example for the anaerobic chemolithotrophs is the methanogens. The methanogens get their name because they actually produce methane. And so what they're doing is their energy source, what they're oxidizing is hydrogen. But because they use CO2 as a terminal electron acceptor, they convert that CO2 to methane gas, thus the name methanogen. And so these guys are a really important part of the carbon cycle, which we're going to talk about in a future video. And one of the concerns is that these guys actually are numerous in the permafrost. This is pretty much perpetually frozen ground towards the poles of the Earth. And what happens is as that ground thaws, the methanogens become more active. As they become more active, they release more methane, and methane is a greenhouse gas, and that can lead to more warming. However, we're going to find out later on in a couple of videos that's not the whole story. But for right now, the methanogens, really, really important. You will also find them associated with cattle and things like that, responsible for releasing methane there as well. Next up, we have our anaerobic chemoorganotrophs. Now again, anaerobic means that what is being reduced is something other than oxygen. So you have things like sulfur and sulfate, and that sulfur or sulfate can eventually get converted to hydrogen sulfide, H2S, and that can give kind of that rotten egg sort of smell. And so if you ever smell that, a lot of times what you have is an anaerobic chemoorganotroph that is doing that. Now, what they're oxidizing, again, they're organotrophs, chemoorganotrophs. So a chemical source of energy, and that chemical is organic. So we're talking about carbs, lipids, proteins. There are other sources of organic compounds as well, but those are by far the most important ones. And when these microbes are doing their thing, they're using the carbs, lipids, and proteins as an energy or electron source, and they're reducing sulfur or sulfate into hydrogen sulfide. Yes, you're going to get that smell. And so they are commonly associated again with mud and sewage. And again, a place where there is no oxygen, because again, if they're obligate anaerobes, they're going to be killed in the presence of oxygen. Now there's an important group of organisms. These are also obligate anaerobes in the sense that they cannot be in the presence of oxygen, but they ferment. They don't have a terminal electron acceptor associated with the electron transport chain. And so these fermenters, a lot of them are the Clostridium genus, i.e. tetanus, and the organism that causes gas gangrene, Clostridium perfringens. So these two are really, really important potential human pathogens. You can see a picture of C. tetani right there that causes tetanus. They're going to oxidize organics, and that's what makes them an important potential human pathogen. So we are organic beings, and so they're using our carbs, lipids, proteins, and our tissue and using that as an electron energy / food source. However, they are also going to ferment gases, and that's going to cause some problems inside of tissues. And what they're really reducing when they are fermenting, remember, our fermenters are going glucose or some type of organic compound, usually to pyruvate. And that pyruvate serves as a terminal electron acceptor, and then they're producing acids, alcohols, and gases as a result. So at the top of the picture there, you can see an example of a diabetic foot ulcer that has gone into a gangrene. And at the bottom here, like I said, that is C. tetani. That is the organism responsible for causing tetanus. And so if you wind up stepping on a rusty nail or cutting yourself in some way with something that's certainly not clean, the first thing they're going to ask you when you go to the emergency room or the urgent care centers, when was the last time you had a tetanus shot? And if it's been over 10 years, like, pop, here you go. And the reason for that is they're trying to they're giving you a vaccine that will allow the immune system to recognize the toxin as being produced by this organism, because the immune system, for the most part, will take care of these Clostridium species, but it's the toxins that become really important, especially for tetanus. You know, another interesting thing about these organisms is the fact that they form spores. And so we talked about the fact that they are obligate anaerobes, and therefore they would die in the presence of oxygen, but they can form spores, and those spores can withstand all kinds of environmental stressors. And so when you step on that rusty nail, you're exposed to something like a Clostridium species. It's the spores that enter the body, and then once they become vegetative cells, they start producing those toxins that can make us very sick. Next up are the aerotolerant chemoorganotrophs. Now, aerotolerant, these are a little bit different. They, like the previous organisms, the Clostridium, they are not using an electron transport chain. And so what they're doing is they are fermenting. Aerotolerant means they can be in the presence of oxygen. They're not killed by it, but they don't use it. And so the aerotolerant organisms, the aerotolerant chemoorganotrophs, often lack an electron transport chain. And so the only thing they can do ferment. They are typically obligate fermenters because of the lack of an electron transport chain. And so they're taking that organic compound, which is what they're oxidizing, right? That's their electron energy / food source. They're oxidizing that, producing pyruvate, and then they're converting that pyruvate often to something like lactic acid. The important organisms there are things like the streptococci, the enterococci, lactococcus, and bacillus. A lot of these organisms are going to be part of the normal flora of the small and large intestine of animals, including human beings. So the next organism is the aerobic chemolithotroph. And so these are aerobic, right? So we're switching gears here a little bit. We're talking about organisms that use oxygen as a terminal electron acceptor. However, They are chemolithotrophic, which means their chemical source of energy is going to be inorganic. Examples: sulfur, ammonia, nitrite. These are really important microbes in aquatic ecosystems. As you can see behind me here and in the picture, they are critical. And the reason they're critical is because they make up a group of organisms known as the nitrifiers. The nitrifiers play a critical role in aquatic environments because all living things eventually secrete ammonia. Now, we human beings do that as a result of eating food, and then we store it as urine, and then we release it that way. But aquatic organisms, they're different. They can secrete their ammonia directly into their aquatic environment, and that ammonia is toxic. Lucky for them, there are microbes that can break down the ammonia, the NH3, and that ammonia is their electron/energy/food source. And so as they're breaking that down, they're actually producing something else that is, well, almost equally as toxic, and that is nitrite, NO2. Luckily, there are other types of microbes that can break down the NO2, the nitrite, and break it down into nitrate. Now, the thing with the ammonia and the nitrite is they can actually destroy the gill tissue of the aquatic organism, causes them to basically suffocate because they can't get oxygen into their system, and they die. And so these microbes are absolutely critical for the nitrogen cycle and the nitrification process in general. So you've got these microbes that are breaking down ammonia into nitrite, nitrite into nitrate. And then in aquatic environments, such as you see behind me here, you have aquatic plants like I do, and that will take up some of the nitrate. Or you can do water changes and remove and lower the nitrate concentrations that way. But these aerobic chemolithotrophs in these aquatic environments are absolutely critical. Without them, you would not have functioning aquatic ecosystems. This next one should look really familiar to you because it is you. Aerobic chemoorganotrophs. That's us human beings. And there are microbes that have a metabolism very similar to us. And so they are aerobic. They are reducing oxygen just like we do. They're using oxygen as a terminal electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. They, just like us, because they are chemoorganotrophs, are using organics, carbs, lipids, and proteins as their electron source. And so that's what we do. There are microbes that do that as well. A couple of the really important types of microbes are the Mycobacterium. Mycobacterium, one of the organisms that falls within that genus, is the one that causes tuberculosis, something that we're going to dive deeper into in a future video. And the other one are the Pseudomonads, things like P. aeruginosa, P. fluorescens. These can sometimes be wound infections, and they can be very, very difficult to treat if they establish themselves in the human body, especially for people who wind up with third-degree burns. P. aeruginosa can be a very, very difficult organism to treat. They can be resistant to antibiotics and different types of soaps and antiseptics. It can be a really big problem, but there are microbes that behave just like us metabolically. Again, a couple of the more important, at least in terms of human pathogens, right here. Last one we're going to cover in this video, and that is the facultative anaerobe that is also a chemoorganotroph. Facultative anaerobes can be horrible pathogens, and they are also very, very, very important parts of our normal flora, our normal microbiota. So because they are chemoorganotrophs, they are oxidizing carbs, lipids, proteins, just like we do. However, facultative anaerobe, what that means is these are microbes that would prefer to use oxygen as their terminal electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. However, if the electron transport chain is not functioning properly, usually because oxygen is lacking, they can switch to fermentation. So a couple of really important microbes that do that: E. coli, Klebsiella. These are microbes that live in the human small and large intestine once again. They are really important parts of that. There are E. coli that are important part of our normal flora. Then there's the pathogenic types as well. Klebsiella, like Klebsiella pneumoniae, can be a problem. There are organisms like KPC, Klebsiella pneumoniae, carbapenemase resistant microbes, and that is a hospital-acquired infection. Usually that can be a big problem in human health as well. So again, what we're doing here is we are classifying microbes based on their terminal electron acceptors and what they're using as an electron source. We've given you a little bit more information. We've given you some specifics in terms of what they look like, where they're found, what they do in an ecosystem. In the next video, we have to switch gears a little bit because we still have to talk about are phototrophs. And as it turns out, even though we already talked about photosynthesis and photosystems 1 and photosystem 2 and the Calvin cycle, well, not all phototrophs are the same. And now we're going to add a little bit more detail to that in the next video. As always, thank you so much for being here. Have a great week, everyone.